glance at me.
The monsoon remembers every name it ever carried. Up in the pine-dark hills of Baguio, where fog moves like a living animal, some words never settle into silence. They circle, they wait, and when the rain returns, they find the one hand willing to answer them. Tonight, we follow Aster Villanueva into an attic that has been holding its breath since 1972. An attic that opens its walls for only one kind of visitor, someone who knows the weight of unsent words. If you've been listening to our stories each week, you already know one truth. Debts in the Philippines are rarely measured in pesos. They're measured in silence, in promises unkept, and in the letters we never send. So settle in, listen to the rain, and remember, when the past writes to you, whose hand is really holding the pen? From Calico Tales Publishing LLC, this is Monsoon Letters. Let's begin. In the high hills of Baguio, where the fog roams like a living animal and the pine trees whisper at night, Aster's return felt like an intrusion into time itself. The old house stood waiting, its steep gabled roof shedding the last of the wet season in reluctant drips. Inside, the attic smelled of dust and rainwater and the kind of ink that had been allowed to sour floorboards. Warped and sighed under Aster's weight as she climbed the narrow staircase to the garret that had once been her Tita Looning's studio. Cobwebs curtained the rafters. Looning's calligraphy supplies still lined the shelves. Antique brass nibs, ink bottles corked shut, handmade papers curling at the edges. Aster ran her fingers along the spine of a ledger and felt a fine layer of soot. She had come home for the funeral and stayed to sort through the possessions, but there was more that pulled her upward that first evening. Fog pressed against the dormer windows until it leaked under the frame like breath. It circled her ankles. Behind the crawl space door, something scratched softly, then paused, as if listening. When the first envelope slid into the room, she thought it was a trick of drafts. Yet the envelope was real, vellum browned by age, sealed with a single pressed sampaguita bloom, addressed in a looping hand that could have been her own. Though she had not yet put pen to paper, the letter had no stamp, no postmark. It simply lay there, impossible and inevitable, her name on the front, Aster L. Reyes. The paper crinkled under Aster's touch like fallen leaves. She broke the seal and unfolded the page. The handwriting was fluid, copperplate, each letter weighted at the downstroke as if written by someone who had practiced for hours by candlelight. Dearest, the letter began, not Dear Aster, but a word that seemed to have been waiting decades to find a recipient. If you are reading this, then the monsoon has carried my words at last. I have waited, and I fear I will wait forever if I do not trust the rain to deliver what my hands could not. The words were dated 1972. The writer signed Milagros Santos. The letter spoke of longing, of a love hidden and thwarted by fathers and uncles, and the weight of propriety. It hinted at meeting a beloved near the old Japanese bridge when the rain was thick enough to hide their faces. It confessed to a crime of silence rather than of action, and it begged the recipient to reply. Aster pressed the letter to her chest, her breath clouding in the cold air, and a quiet dread crept up her spine. Tita Luning had told her stories of the house's quirks, the piano that played a single note on its own, the smell of boiled sugar that came when no one was cooking, but she had never mentioned ghost letters. Aster descended the stairs to the kitchen where Luning's wake candles still burned. "Tita," she whispered into the flickering light, "did you know?" But the candles only swayed. The priest's prayer book lay open, and the edges of its pages lifted as if turned by an unseen breeze. Aster thought she heard the faint rasp of a dry tongue across parchment. The envelope, with its pressed flower, lay on the table like a question. Sleep did not come easily that night. Baguio's damp cold seeped into her bones, and the attic above seemed to breathe and mutter. She dreamed of ink flowing backwards, of letters unwriting themselves. In the morning, she brought the letter to the breakfast table where her cousins had gathered between the tasks of mourning. "Tita Luning," she asked quietly when the aunts were in the kitchen, "did you ever hear of Milagros Santos?" Her aunt's fork paused above her adobo. The women exchanged glances. Tita Luning, still alive in those dreams, smiled in memory. "Milagros," she dabbed her mouth with her napkin. "Ah, Milagros. She was a girl who lived up the slope. She died before she could marry." Aster slid the letter over. "This was delivered last night. It's dated 1972. Luning traced the handwriting and nodded slowly. "I knew her. She would post letters at the old box by the pine tree when it rained, but she never received replies. She fell ill and died during the monsoon. Maybe she wrote to you by mistake." The aunts crossed themselves. Aster felt the weight of their gaze. "Do not answer that," one whispered. "Stories are debts. If you accept them, you must pay." The phrase lodged in Aster's mind. She had built a career on shaping the words of others. Wedding invitations, birth announcements, award certificates. Beautiful on the surface, but not her own. This letter, yellowed and smelling faintly of Sampaguita, was different. It called to her. It insisted. That afternoon, as the sky darkened and the scent of rain thickened, she sat at her work table, dipped her nib in ink, and wrote back. Her reply was cautious at first. "Milagros," she wrote, "I do not know how your letter has reached me. I am Aster, not the person you expected. I am sorry for your pain. Tell me what you need." She wrote in her finest hand, each curve deliberate, though her fingers trembled with cold and something else. She felt as if she were addressing the void. When the rain began in earnest, she slid her reply under the crawl space door from which the first letter had emerged. The edge of the paper vanished as if it had been pulled by a child's impatient fingers. Aster gasped. Thunder rolled through the mountains. A moment later, nothing. She waited, heart hammering, for an answer. The next morning, the house was silent, as if holding its breath. Fog lay thick as milk outside the attic windows. Aster crept to the door and found another envelope lying neatly on the floorboards. Aster, it read this time, as if the writer had adjusted their address. "I knew you would answer. Rain is the only courier I trust. One letter per rain, one truth per storm." The second letter told of a beloved identified only as R, of arranged marriages and promises broken. She signed her beloved only as R, a single initial carrying the weight of a life she could never safely name. "He ordered me never to see her," Milagros wrote. He threatened to cut off my fingers so I could not write to her. But how can love abide by rules written by others? Aster, will you hold my words? Will you keep them until they are safe? Aster could feel the writer's desperation seeping up through the lines. The letters were not simply storytelling, they were a ledger of debts owed and paid in ink. Days unfolded like damp sheets hung to dry in a kitchen. Each afternoon, clouds gathered, rain drummed on tin roofs, and a new letter appeared. Aster found herself waiting for them, worrying over them as if they were living creatures. The handwriting began to shift. At first, it remained consistent, but soon Aster saw her own flourishes creeping into the downstrokes of Milagros's script. Sometimes, when working on a client commission, she would glance at her hand and see loops she had not intended, a slant that mimicked the ghost letters the ghost was teaching her or claiming her hand. She would wake with ink on her fingers and sentences she did not remember writing. In the letters, Milagros's story unfurled. She met Rosalina R. in secret at the old Japanese bridge. They traded embroidered handkerchiefs. They promised to run away after the harvest festival. But when the monsoon came, Milagros fell ill. Rosalina's father discovered their letters and burned them. Milagros wrote one final letter begging Rosalina to come to the bridge despite the rain. "If you do not, I will think you never loved me," she penned. The letter disappeared into the postbox with a brass R plate. She waited all night in the rain, burning with fever, but Rosalina never came. The next day, Milagros was confined to bed and never rose. She died believing she had been abandoned. Aster wiped away tears at the narrative's cruelty and wondered what choice a young seamstress like Rosalina would have had against her father's will. Outside the attic, life continued. Baguio pulsed with the quiet buzz of small radios and jeepneys. At night, Aster listened to the local station where Paulo Arriaga hosted his call-in program. His voice was soft and deep, the kind that could coax confessions from strangers. He read dedications and played folk songs. One evening, moved by impulse, Aster wrote an anonymous note about a letter arriving decades late. She signed it simply, "From the Attic." Paulo read it aloud, his voice wrapping around her secret. "If anyone knows about ghost letters in La Trinidad or Baguio, call in," he invited. The phone line lit up. An elderly woman phoned to say she had heard of Milagros and Rosalina's forbidden love. They say their love was like the pine trees. The caller crackled, always green but brittle under storm. The next night, another caller claimed his grandmother knew a man named Ricardo who forbade his daughter from seeing anyone. Each account added layers to the legend. Paulo suggested they interview Aster on air, but she hesitated. Her part in the story felt intimate and bartered, yet she found herself scribbling notes about the timbre of his voice and the static hum behind his laughter. When he finally visited, his hair damp with fog and his hands smelling of old vinyl records, he stepped into the attic and flinched at the sudden drop in temperature. "This is where the letters come," he whispered. Aster showed him the crawl space door. They stood in silence and waited together. Rain tapped its fingers against the roof like someone impatient at a door. It was Paolo who first heard the sound that Aster had been too busy fearing to identify: the faint scratch of metal on wood, as if a small brass plate were being lifted in the wall. They crouched beside the paneling and pressed their ears against the boards. Something shifted behind them and an envelope slid into view. Paolo nearly dropped his recorder. "You weren't exaggerating," he breathed. Aster picked up the letter. Milagros was angry. "Who is with you?" she demanded on the page. "Do not bring outsiders. 1 letter per reign. The ink is ours alone." The handwriting writhed like a living thing, the lines thicker, the downstrokes almost cutting through the paper. Aster felt her own guilt bloom. She wrote back, apologizing, explaining she needed help. She could not keep the story alone. The next letter arrived saturated with jealousy. "He will not take you," Milagros warned. "I have waited too long to be displaced by someone with a radio voice." The letters dripped, literally. The ink beaded at the edges and trailed like raindrops across the page. When Aster washed her hands, black rivulets swirled down the sink and spelled out words that dissolved before she could read them. The more Aster wrote and received, the more the attic itself seemed to lean toward the correspondence. Objects shifted, pens rolled across the table as if nudged by invisible fingers. At times, letters Aster had written for clients came back from the post office with new phrases added in Milagros's hand. "Always yours. Between rains. Do not forget." Ink dried slower. In a shallow drawer, she discovered an old brass key she had never seen. It lay among dried pine needles, as if it had grown there. It had a tag with the letter R. The same afternoon, a knock came at the kitchen door. An elderly woman stood on the stoop, holding a shawl around her shoulders and an umbrella despite the clear sky. "Are you the one answering Milagros?" she asked. Her eyes were sharp behind thick glasses. "I am Rosalina's granddaughter." Aster led her inside. Over tea, the woman told her that Rosalina had indeed received Milagros's final letter, but had been locked inside her room by her father. She tried to escape, but he beat her. She hid the letter behind a loose board in her dowry chest. She married another man and burned the bridge where she had once met Milagros. Before she died, she told her granddaughter to find the house with the old postbox and deliver a key. "It fits the wall, not the box," the granddaughter whispered. "My Lola said the truth must be unlocked." She pressed the key into Aster's palm. That night, with the storm shaking the eaves and lightning painting white veins across the ceiling, Aster and Paolo returned to the attic. The air crackled with humidity and something like anticipation. They moved furniture, their breath misting, and found an irregular line in the wall. The brass key slid into the hidden lock as if guided. With a soft groan, a panel swung open to reveal a cavity stuffed with charred scraps of paper. The smell of smoke and old regret wafted out. On top lay a folded letter, edges blackened, writing inside still legible. It was Rosalina's confession. Milagros, it read. I came, I swear I came in the rain. My father followed me with a stick. He dragged me home by my braid. I screamed your name, but the wind carried it away. I could not leave again. When I learned you had died, I wove your name into every pillowcase I made. I loved you. Forgive me. Aster's vision blurred. She had been holding the story of a betrayal that was really a tragedy of intersecting duties and fear. She wanted to place this letter under the crawl space and be done, but the storm outside was not yet done, and the attic's walls flickered with light. Milagros was not listening yet. Typhoon winds whistled and the roof's tin sheets rattled like loose teeth. Water dripped through the old shingles and pattered on the floor, darkening the wood. Milagros's next letter came like a slash across the room. You are lying, it accused, before Aster had even replied. She never came. If she had loved me, I would have felt it. The handwriting crawled and knotted, crossing itself. The ink refused to stay on the page. It coiled like a living centipede and escaped. Aster felt her own hand twitching, as if wanting to mimic that anger. Paolo tried to read the words aloud, but his voice broke. She needs to hear Rosalina's confession, he said hoarsely. On air, people must witness. Aster balked. Reading the letter publicly felt like exposing a corpse, but the house creaked and a beam overhead groaned. Aster smelled smoke where there was no flame. She realized the ghost's fury could ignite more than anger. The next lightning flash struck the pine tree outside. She heard the crack, the rush of sap boiling. Sparks flew into the air. Please, she whispered to the attic. Listen. She placed Rosalina's letter under the crawl space. It disappeared. She waited. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the walls vibrated. A draft wove through the room, smelling of burnt hair and wet paper. Aster retrieved the next letter. Liar. It scrawled. The ink burned tiny holes through the vellum. The attic caught fire when thunder cracked directly above. A streak of white light split the darkness, and a loud crack shook the house. Smoke curled from a wooden beam. Sparks jumped to the boxes of paper and aged cloth. Suddenly, flames licked the edges of the ghost letters stacked on the work table. Aster and Paolo lunged to smother them, but heat erupted. Milagros's words scrawled across the smoke itself. Stay with me. The sentence hovered in the air like a brand. Aster choked, eyes watering. She coughed and inhaled more smoke. The door seemed farther away with every second. Leave, Paolo shouted, pulling her toward the stairs, but a beam fell and blocked the path. The sound was deafening, like a train passing through the house. Splinters flew, embers leapt and landed in Aster's hair. She slapped them away. The ghost's presence pressed against her skin like humid cloth. She felt a tug at her wrist, as if an unseen hand gripping her. I have waited decades. A voice seemed to hiss from the walls. You will not leave me again. Aster remembered Tita Luning's phrase, stories are debts. She thought of Milagros dying, feverish, thinking Rosalina had abandoned her. She thought of Rosalina beating at a locked door, her father's grip on her braid. The debt was a miscommunication, withheld truth. Aster could not pay it by burning. She had one option, to tell the story where both could hear. Crouched on the floor as smoke thickened and Paolo shouted uselessly into his cell phone, Aster grabbed an unburned envelope and dipped her nib into the stormwater dripping from the ceiling. Rainwater mixed with ash formed an ink as grey as clouds. She wrote quickly, her letters wobbling with urgency. Milagros, she wrote, this is Rosalina's truth. She came, she fought her father, she screamed your name, she wept and wove your name in every pillowcase. She loved you, you were not abandoned. Her handwriting blurred as drops fell, but she continued. She wrote that love could be silenced by fathers, but not denied. She wrote that the town still spoke their names. She wrote that their story had haunted houses and attics, had made people cross themselves and warn their daughters. She wrote that debts become owed when truth is withheld, and that she was done carrying someone else's burden alone. Paolo dialed the radio station with his free hand and pressed the speaker to her face. You're live, came a crackling voice. Aster spoke, reading the letter aloud between coughs. She told the entire story to the town, to anyone tuned in on that stormy night. She read Milagros's letters and Rosalina's confession. She read her own, the one she had just written with rainwater, her voice breaking but steady. On the other end, silence. Even the crackle of static seemed to hold its breath. Then Paolo's producer whispered, our switchboard is lighting up. Voices poured through the line, old women crying that they remembered Milagros, singing at fiestas, men who said their mothers had embroidered 2 interlocked initials on pillowcases and never explained why. The community became a chorus of witnesses, confirming and correcting, layering their truths over Aster's. As Aster read, the smoke in the attic began to thin. The flames, which had licked greedily at old paper, seemed to bend away from her. Rain hammered harder on the roof and, through a broken board, fell in sheets onto the burning table, hissing as if angered. The word in the smoke, stay, dissolved into curls that looked for a moment like 2 silhouettes walking away, hand in hand. Aster felt the pressure on her wrist loosen. An immense sadness swept through her, but also relief. She sensed a presence, listening finally, not to the words on paper, but to the words spoken aloud. Thank you, a whisper said, so faint she thought she imagined it. The last of the flames died. The attic, charred and soaked, steamed gently in the cold air. Paolo pushed the fallen beam aside with a crowbar, and they stumbled down the stairs, coughing, hearts pounding. When Aster woke in the hospital, the world smelled of disinfectant and rain-washed pine. Her hair was singed and her hands were bandaged, but she was alive. Paolo sat beside her bed, dark circles under his eyes, holding a cup of coffee. He had broadcast the whole ordeal, the letters, the fire, the reading, and the town had responded with casseroles and blankets and offers to repair her roof. You're something of a legend now, he murmured. The woman who answers ghosts. He laughed weakly. Aster squeezed his hand. She thought of Milagros and Rosalina, of the decades between them and her, of the way stories can persist like mold in damp wood. When she was discharged, she returned to the attic and, with help, cleaned out the debris. Only one thing remained unscathed, a single sheet of paper lying on the floor where the writing desk had been. It was blank, save for a single drop of rain at its center. Aster framed it and hung it above her new work table. It reminded her that emptiness can be its own answer, that sometimes the most important part of a letter is the silence at the end. She resumed her calligraphy commissions, but now she also took on personal projects. She wrote letters she had never allowed herself, to her younger self, to Tita Luning, to a friend she had ghosted. She wrote on thick paper that smelled of cedar and smoke. Paolo's radio show added a weekly segment called Unsent Letters, where listeners could send in words they had never dared mail. Aster guested frequently, her voice still raspy from smoke, and read them aloud. People wrote to dead lovers, estranged siblings, teachers long gone. Each letter had weight. Each was a ledger item being settled. Paolo became more than a voice on the line. He visited the attic often, bringing vinyl records and fresh bread. On quiet afternoons, he helped Aster catalog the remaining letters. They discovered, among stacks of yellowed paper, small gifts, pressed flowers, a lock of braided hair tied with ribbon, a bit of lace. She wasn't only longing, Aster mused one day. She loved, she lived. The letters are full of birthdays and rainbows and complaining about laundry. Paolo smiled, stretching his legs toward the window. Outside, the fog thinned to reveal terraced gardens glistening after the storm. A calico cat appeared on the sill, fur wet, paws leaving tiny prints on the wood. It blinked at them, its eyes two different colors, one amber, one green, then curled its tail around its body and began to purr. "Where did you come from?" Paolo whispered. The cat flicked its ear. They let it in. It padded to the framed blank page, sniffed, and lay beneath it as if guarding a portal. Seasons in Baguio blurred between rains and fog. Aster learned that the attic did not have to be a place of dread. It could be a studio filled with light and the scent of ink on clean paper. She sanded the char off the beams and painted the walls a pale cream that glowed even on cloudy days. She filled jars with rainwater collected during drizzle and downpours, labeling them by date to use as ink for future truth-telling. Sometimes, when she dipped a pen into a jar, from the night of the fire, the line came out darker, as if charged with ghost memory. She practiced drawing lines that were hers alone. She wrote her name in bold loops she had previously reserved for clients. When she encountered the letters she had written in Milagros's hand, she treated them with the same care she had given the ghosts. They were hers now, after all, part of her ledger of stories answered. She used them to teach workshops on the power of the written word, inviting high schoolers to write letters to their future selves and drop them in the old brass postbox. "One letter per rain," she joked, and they laughed without knowing the weight behind the rule. In moments of quiet, Aster still caught glimpses of Milagros, in the way the calico cat would stare at the corner of the room and purr, in a whiff of sampaguita that would drift through the house on dry days, in the sudden itch in her fingers that made her want to write even when she had nothing to say. She did not fear these presences. They felt like an honoring, Occasionally she heard a song on Paolo's program, an old kundiman about love forbidden by class or clan, and saw in her mind two young women meeting by a moss-covered bridge, rain cloaking their faces. She imagined Milagros placing her palm against Rosalina's cheek, felt the shock of cold skin. She imagined Rosalina weaving names into pillowcases in the dark, each stitch a vow. She imagined fathers loosening their grip, communities learning to witness rather than judge. Each imagining was a kind of letter written to the past. Aster understood now that the act of writing, of articulating truth and desire, is an act of love, even when the recipient never reads it. Tita Luning's absence resonated differently. When Aster had first come home, she felt orphaned by the world. Now she recognized in her aunt's silence a form of knowing Luning had seen the letters and had not answered because she believed they belonged to someone else. But she kept the house, kept the postbox, kept the stories until someone who was meant to answer arrived. She had left Aster the tools, nibs, ink, paper with which to reckon with the debts. In Aster's mind, Luning became another woman in a lineage of keepers and writers, not the last, but part of a long calligraphic chain that stretched back to nuns illuminating manuscripts and forward to teenagers scribbling band names on notebooks. Remembering this heritage gave Aster a feeling of kinship across time. She began sometimes to address her letters, "Dear future aunt," or "Dear woman who will inherit this desk," entrusting her words to women she would never meet. It was comforting to know that one day someone might feel her presence as she had felt Milagros's. Paolo's story unfolded alongside hers. They did not name what was happening between them, not at first. They cooked meals together, making sinigang when the clouds hung low, toasting bread on the wood stove when the electricity flickered. Paolo shared stories from his childhood. He had grown up listening to faraway radio stations, imagining the lives of the DJs, and pretending to speak into a microphone fashioned from a broom handle his father had left when he was young. And letters from him had arrived sporadically, always full of apologies and promises that never materialized. Paolo confessed that he had never replied to any of those letters. "Maybe I should," he said one night, his thumb tracing the rim of a mug. "Maybe my silence is someone else's ghost." Aster nodded. They sat with the weight of his unspoken words between them. A week later, she found an envelope addressed in Paolo's handwriting, placed gently inside the old brass postbox. Waiting for rain, the calico cat grew fat and lazy, spending afternoons stretched across the sunbeam that fell through the attic's small window. Children from the neighborhood began to visit, drawn by tales of ghost letters and by Aster's calm explanations. She turned the attic into a small community archive, cataloging the letters, making digital copies for those who wanted them, and storing them in acid-free boxes. She invited Rosalina's granddaughter back, and the woman wept to see her Lola's confession preserved. "This," she said, her palm pressing down on the box, "is worth more than inheritance money. It is closure." The story attracted an artist from Manila who wanted to paint the attic for an exhibit on letters and time. When she finished, the painting depicted not only the room, but faint figures made of swirling fog. A cat watching with mismatched eyes, and two women standing on either side of a bridge, reaching toward each other. Aster bought the painting and hung it below the framed blank page. Years passed, marked by monsoon seasons and by the number of unsent letters read on air. Aster's hair grayed at the temples. Paolo's voice took on the patina of age. The calico cat had kittens. One stayed and became the new attic sentinel. The story of Milagros and Rosalina became part of local folklore taught in schools as a cautionary tale about listening and love. Teenage boys brought their girlfriends to see the attic to show they were brave, or to whisper promises in the shadow of old ghosts. Grandmothers brought their grandchildren to teach them that truth does not stay buried. Researchers from universities wrote papers on epistolary hauntings in northern Luzon. The ghost letters of Baguio appeared in travel blogs, drawing tourists who touched the postbox and hoped for messages. Some were disappointed not to find a supernatural spectacle. Others were moved simply standing in a room where so much longing had once burned. In quiet moments between visitors and rains, Aster would sit with a pen and write not to ghosts or lovers, but to herself. She wrote about the feeling of wet ink pooling at the base of a letter. She wrote about how the scent of pine changed when mingled with smoke. She wrote about fog as a metaphor for memory, how it obscures but also softens. She wrote about the way truth, when spoken aloud, can extinguish anger the way rain extinguishes fire. She wrote that she no longer needed the ghost letters to feel connected to the past. She had become part of the story. The line she drew across the page was clean, intentional, and belonged to no one else. It was a demarcation between before and after, between the debt she inherited and the story she chose to write. She wrote, "Finally, I forgive myself for the letters I never answered." The act of writing those words felt like releasing her own ghost. A few rains later, among Milagros's letters came one that read differently. It was not accusatory or pleading, it was reflective. The handwriting was calmer, the ink drier at the edges, as if written slowly. "Dearest Aster," she began, "or whoever my words reach, forgive me for writing of myself. I was not always a ghost of longing. When I was 12, my mother gave me a bamboo pen carved by my grandfather and a bottle of ink made from boiled guava leaves. She taught me to trace the alphabet on banana leaves, to feel the roughness of each stroke beneath my fingers. I loved the way letters felt like shapes to be mastered, the way words could be woven like embroidery. At night, after chores were done, I would lie by the window with a candle stub and practice my loops, copying the names of the saints, the names of the actresses in the magazines I borrowed. I did not know who I would write to yet, only that writing made me feel larger than the valley we lived in. When I met Rosalina, calligraphy became our secret script. We traded pages like kisses, each flourish a promise. If my hand still reaches you through rain, know that it remembers the feel of paper, the smell of guava ink, the joy of making a mark that is my own. The letter made Aster ache. It mirrored her own childhood, hunched over a borrowed primer, practicing strokes with Tita Luning's guidance. And it reminded her that before Milagros was a haunting, she was a girl with dreams and skills. Aster copied the letter into her own journal, feeling each word settle like a weight and a gift. One morning, long before the monsoon returned, Aster walked down to the old Japanese bridge the letters spoke of. Paolo came with her, carrying a thermos of ginger tea. The bridge had weathered decades of storms and war. its stones moss-covered and slick. The creek beneath murmured over smooth rocks, carrying pine needles and fallen leaves to a ravine. Aster stood at the midpoint and touched the low wall, imagining Milagros waiting here in the rain. Feverish and hopeful, she closed her eyes and let the sounds wash over her. Running water, distant roosters, the faint hum of a tricycle. On the road beyond, she whispered the names Milagros, Rosalina, and for a moment thought she heard a sigh that was not her own. She left a paper boat made from thick calligraphy paper on the water. On it, she wrote in careful script, "Let all unsent words find harbor." The boat bobbed, caught in an eddy, then spun free and drifted downstream. Paolo read the names carved in the stone railing, Japanese characters left by soldiers who had built the bridge decades before. "Even these men wrote their presence," he murmured. "Maybe ghosts write themselves wherever we look." They sat on the bridge until the sun rose high and the fog lifted, revealing terraces and tin roofs below. Visiting the bridge gave Aster a sense of closure and connection. It grounded the ghost story in earth and water and reminded her that love letters, whether answered or not, change landscapes. After the fire and the broadcast, word spread beyond Baguio about the ghost letters. People from nearby towns began to bring their own unsent words. At first, they slipped envelopes discreetly into the brass postbox at the side of Aster's house, the one with the letter R. Then, emboldened, they left folded pages on her porch, tucked under pots of basil, slid through mail slots of neighbors whose loved ones had gone abroad and never returned. Aster read some aloud on Paolo's show with permission. A man wrote to his brother in Manila about a fight over land. A mother wrote to her son working in Riyadh, telling him she was proud of him despite the silence. A teenage girl wrote to the crush she had never dared to speak to, saying she loved the way he laughed when it rained. The letters were messy, heartfelt, crisscrossed with corrections and tears. Paolo's switchboard flooded each week with callers who wanted to hear their words spoken by Aster's steady voice. In the schoolyard and the market, people began to speak of sending letters as if sending prayers. An old vendor folded a letter into the shape of a bird and hung it from his stall. A carpenter carved a new postbox with carved waves on its sides. The act of writing returned like a festival game everyone wanted to play. Aster felt as if a dam had broken. All the withheld words of generations flowed outward, each ink drop a small act of liberation. At the community center, Aster started a calligraphy workshop. Children and teenagers gathered with their parents, intrigued by the idea of turning their handwriting into art. She laid out nibs and jars of ink, stacks of cream-colored paper. She showed them how to angle their pens, how to let the downstroke be heavy and the upstroke light. She told them about the history of writing in the Philippines, Baybayin carved on bamboo, Spanish script imposed on ledgers, how calligraphy had been used to record laws and love alike. A quiet girl named Leah sat in the back, her eyes red from crying. During break, she slipped Aster a note. "My mom died last year," the note said. "I cannot talk to her. Can I write to her here?" Aster squeezed Leah's hand and nodded. Together they prepared a sheet of paper. Leah's first lines were shaky, but soon they steadied. "Mama," she wrote, "I miss the way you smelled of ginger and soap. I miss your loud voice. I am angry that you left, but I still eat your sopa's recipe every Tuesday." Tears fell, smudging the ink, but Aster showed her how smudges could become part of the art. Like raindrops, they read the letter aloud on Paolo's show, and a week later, another woman called in to say she recognized the recipe and wanted to teach Leah a variation. Letters built bridges, not only between the living and the dead, but between strangers who shared a dish or a memory. Leah started coming every week, her shoulders slowly loosening. Paolo, who had always been comfortable on air, found himself hesitant when it came to his own unsent letter. One afternoon, after assisting Aster with a stack of cursive practice sheets, he sat at the attic window, the calico cat on his lap. He looked out at the wet roofs and began to write. "Dear Tate," he wrote, and stopped, surprised by the knot in his throat. He continued, "You left when I was 6. You sent 3 letters in 15 years. I never answered because I wanted to punish you with silence, but silence punished me instead. I tell other people's stories on radio and sometimes feel like a liar because I won't tell my own. I don't know where you are now. Part of me hopes you will never read this because I don't want to open the wound. Part of me hopes you will, because maybe then you will know I loved you even while I was angry." He signed his full name and added, "Your son." He placed the letter in the brass postbox and went to the station. Weeks passed with no reply. One day, an envelope arrived at the station from a coastal town where his father had gone to work as a fisherman. Inside was a short note. "Paolo, I listened to your show and heard the letter. I cried. I am sorry. I thought I could not do better for you than to leave, so you would not see me fail. I was wrong. I did not know how to write then. I am learning now. Can we start with rain?" Paolo wept in the control room, his sobs spilling into the commercial break. He did not read the letter on air. Some letters, he learned, are meant for only 2 people, but writing it had made room in him for other stories. The Calico Cat became a legend of her own. Children named her Kulai because of her patchwork fur. She seemed to appear whenever a letter had particular weight. Once, during a particularly dry season when rain seemed reluctant to fall, Kulai disappeared for 3 days. Aster worried. On the 4th night, a thunderstorm broke over the mountains, and Kulai returned, soaked, carrying in her mouth a spool of faded thread tied with a ribbon. Aster recognized the pattern. Delicate flowers embroidered along the ribbon's edge, like the handkerchiefs Milagros described. She gently took the spool and unwound a length of thread. Wrapped around it was a tiny piece of paper with smeared writing, "For A, so she will remember to mend what tears." Aster smiled through her tears. Whether the message came from Milagros, Rosalina, Tita Luning, or some other seamstress ghost, it felt like a benediction. Kulai purred loudly, shook rainwater onto Aster's lap, and then curled up on the spindle of the printing press. Paolo joked that the cat had access to an entire dimension of attics. Aster began to tie a bit of thread to each letter she sent in response to the new correspondence, a way of saying that stories and stitches hold us together. As the ghost letters gained notoriety, a blogger from Manila wrote a viral post about the haunted post box of Baguio. Teenagers began to send emails asking if Milagros accepted digital messages. Aster smiled at the idea of a ghost checking her inbox. She decided to answer these inquiries by inviting people to write by hand and then scan or photograph their letters to share online. "There is something in the slowness of writing," she typed in a reply, "that makes you listen to your own heart. But if a keyboard is the only tool you have, then send your words anyway. The rain does not judge whether you speak Tagalog or Ilocano, whether your letters are looped or typed. It only carries what you release." Some digital correspondents printed their letters and mailed them physically to Aster so she could burn them in the rain for them. Others started a hashtag sharing pictures of their envelopes by windowsills during storms. A new generation of letter writers emerged, blending tradition with technology. Aster occasionally worried about commodification, ghost tours, merchandise, an influencer wanting to film a spooky vlog in her attic, but she set boundaries. The attic was not a stage, but a chapel. She allowed some photographs, but insisted on privacy during writing sessions. She understood that the story would evolve, as all stories do, and her role was to keep its core, truth owed, debts paid, intact. Not long after Leah's letter, Aster dreamed vividly she saw Milagros sitting by a window in the attic, a shawl over her shoulders, her hair loose. Rain fell softly outside. A door creaked and Rosalina entered. Older than the girl in the stories, but still luminous. They faced each other and, without words, pressed their foreheads together. Around them, letters fluttered like moths. Rosalina held out her palm, and Milagros placed a pressed sampaguita in it. Then they turned toward Aster, as if noticing her for the first time. Milagros smiled and said, "You gave us back our time." Rosalina added, "Now take yours." They pointed to a line on the table, drawn in Aster's own handwriting. Aster felt a warmth spread through her and woke with tears on her cheeks, and her hand clutched around an unseen object. When she opened her fist, there was nothing there but the impression of a flower's stem. She took it as permission to move forward. Dreams became another form of letter, she realized. Messages from those who cannot reach us by ink alone. Some letters Aster wrote, she never sent at all. One rainy afternoon, she drove out to the cemetery where her parents rested. The hills were slippery, and she carried an umbrella and a stack of thick paper. She sat on the damp grass between their graves, knees muddy, and wrote. "Ma," she wrote, "I wish I had asked you about your first love. I only learned from neighbors after you were gone that you had wanted to be a nurse but married early because of me." She wrote to her father about the time he taught her to ride a bicycle and then disappeared for 3 months with no explanation. "I was angry," she admitted. "I poured ink instead of tears." She wrote that she forgave them for their silences, that she understood now how fear and duty and love tangle like threads. When she finished, she read the letters aloud, letting the rain carry her words into the earth. She did not burn them. She folded them and buried them at the foot of the headstones. On the drive home, she felt lighter, as if she had been carrying those unsent words like stones in her pockets. Years melded into decades. The ghost letters remained part of Baguio's lore, but they were no longer the sensational story of a haunting. They were a parable about listening. Visitors still came, some hoping for a thrill, others seeking solace. Many left with ink on their hands and a letter in their heart. Aster grew older, her hair white, her handwriting looser, but still elegant. Paolo's voice softened with age, yet retained its warmth. They married quietly in a civil ceremony, exchanging vows. They wrote in their best script, witnessed by Kulai's great-great-grandkitten, curled on a cushion. Their wedding rings were simple, engraved not with their names, but with two interlocking loops reminiscent of calligraphy strokes. The attic became a museum, a workshop, and a sanctuary. Students who had written their first letters there returned as adults to donate letters of their own, their lives having been shaped by that act of writing. The community center expanded to include an archive and a coffee shop. Local poets read ghost letters alongside new poems. Scholars cited the attic story as an example of Philippine epistolary tradition and queer resistance. When Aster's hands finally trembled too much to write, she dictated letters to her apprentices. Her last letter, written on a rainy day, was addressed to anyone who inherits stories. It read, "Listen when your house creaks. Listen when old people repeat themselves. Listen when rain falls harder than it needs to. There is truth in the spaces we often ignore. Do not be afraid of ghosts. They are just debts waiting to be paid, and paying them is not a curse, but an act of love." After she died, the letter was displayed next to the blank page with a single drop of rain. Tourists stood before it in silence, some wiping tears. Outside, rain fell softly on tin roofs, and the new keeper of the attic opened a jar to collect it. When the attic was cleared of debris, Aster found not just ghost letters, but a small trunk belonging to Tita Luning. Inside were journals bound in cloth, their pages filled with neat handwriting. The entries spanned decades, beginning in the 1950s when Luning had been 19 and working as a clerk at Camp John Hay, the American military base in Baguio. She wrote about the thrill of hearing jazz records and learning English phrases from soldiers. She wrote about a corporal named James who taught her how to write his name in cursive and who asked her to write his love letters to a girl back in Ohio. He said my handwriting was nicer than his, Luning wrote. He paid me 5 pesos per letter and taught me how to waltz in the barracks. He said if things were different, he would marry me. The journal changed tone as years passed. Luning wrote of the day James was transferred, of how she stood in the rain watching the convoy leave. She wrote of the letter he never sent from Ohio and of the one she never sent to him. The letter still folded inside the journal, unsent and yellowed. "My dearest James," it began, "I never told you that I loved the way your handwriting slanted. I learned to write your G. I did not send this because I did not want to be a fool." Aster traced her aunt's letters with a trembling finger. Luning had always been stoic, practical, unromantic to an outsider, yet here were her teenage feelings preserved in ink. Aster decided to read Luning's story on air with Paolo's gentle guidance, not to shame her, but to honor her as another keeper of unsent words. Listeners called in, remembering the American soldiers, the dances, the heartbreak left in trunks. Luning's unsent letter joined Milagros's on the ledger of debts paid. Another day, rummaging through a forgotten crate behind the crawl space, Aster found letters written during the Second World War. They were brittle, written in a mixture of English, Ilocano, and Japanese, and addressed to names she did not recognize. A baker to his son fighting in the mountains, a nurse to her fiancé stationed in the plains, a Japanese soldier apologizing to a Filipino family for commandeering their house. Some letters had been answered, others had not. The ink had bled where water had seeped, but the emotion remained. Aster dried them carefully and read them over many nights. One from 1942 said, "I baked a bread shaped like your smile today. I do not know if you will eat it in heaven or here. When you return, every loaf rises like hope and collapses like news." She contacted the local historical society, and together they traced some of the descendants. An elderly man arrived one afternoon, shaking, and recognized his father's handwriting. He read the letter and sobbed like a child. "He never came back," he whispered, "but now I have something of him." Aster realized that not all debts are owed by the same person, but that some can be paid by community. She organized an exhibit at the community center displaying the war letters alongside present-day notes of peace and forgiveness. Veterans came, teenagers came, a Japanese ambassador came and apologized publicly for the occupation. It was messy, emotional, but cathartic. Paolo narrated the exhibit for listeners who could not travel. Milagros' story had opened a door, and through it, countless other voices walked. Not everyone was comfortable with the idea of ghosts. After the broadcast, a local priest appeared at Aster's gate, carrying a bottle of holy water. A small crowd of parishioners and a group of curious neighbors stood behind him. "We have heard of hauntings," he said, eyes darting to the attic window. "We wish to bless your home to ensure no unquiet spirits linger." Aster, though not particularly religious, respected their intent. She invited them in. The priest sprinkled water on the door frames and murmured Latin prayers. He moved to pour holy water into the crawl space, but Aster gently placed her hand over his. "They are gone," she said. "They were never demons." The priest nodded reluctantly and instead blessed the room with a prayer for peace. Later that week, a babaylan, a traditional healer, visited uninvited. She wore a necklace of beads and carried a woven basket of herbs. She lit incense made of dried herbs and chanted in a language older than the church. She waved smoke into corners and listened to the walls as if they spoke. "Your house has been a portal," she told Aster, "not just for ghosts, for truth." She gave Aster a bundle of sage and leaves of alibangbang. "Burn these when the air grows heavy," she instructed, "not to chase away spirits, but to remind them they are welcome only if they come with truth." The juxtaposition of Catholic ritual and indigenous healing underscored the tension in the community between imported faith and ancestral practices. Aster honored both. When she lit the alibangbang leaves, the smoke smelled like mango and memory. She found comfort in combining rituals, understanding that writing letters was another kind of prayer. In another letter that arrived after the storm, Milagros wrote in detail about ordinary moments with Rosalina, providing color and texture to a love often reduced to tragedy. Do you know what it is like, she penned, to hide a smile behind the folds of a market basket? We would meet near the vegetable stall. She would slip me an extra handful of calamansi and brush my wrist, and I would feel electricity more powerful than any lightning. We dared not speak of love openly. Instead, we talked about rice prices and the weather while carving initials into bread dough with our fingernails. The dough rose with our laughter. We embroidered our names in code on handkerchiefs, her initial hidden in the stem of a vine, mine in the swirl of a flower. We planned to flee to Manila on the night of San Juan Festival. I would bring my pens, she would bring a sewing kit. We would set up a stall and sell invitations and pillowcases to couples. I imagined our tiny apartment smelling like ink and starch. We were fools, perhaps, but fools together. That is the memory I cling to. Not the bridge in the rain, but the way she once wiped flour from my cheek with the back of her hand in a kitchen full of steam. The letter read like a photograph. Aster could see the market, smell the bread, hear the intimate conversation cloaked in mundane words. It made Milagros and Rosalina human again, not just figures in a cautionary tale. As Aster aged, she often sat by the window with a mug of Barako coffee and thought about the unseen forces that shape lives. She thought about how a single letter, delayed or delivered, could alter a destiny. She thought about how the act of writing slowed her racing mind, allowed her to untangle feelings, created a trace of her existence. She wrote down her musings in a notebook with a cloth cover embroidered with sampaguita flowers. We live in letters, she wrote. We live in the stories we tell and the stories we refuse to tell. We are made of what we write down and what we burn. Rain is a kind of ink. Fire is a kind of eraser. Fog is a kind of revision. We owe each other our voices. She acknowledged that not all stories need to be told publicly. Some are sacred secrets. She wrote that the act of listening without judgment is as holy as any prayer. If I have learned anything, she concluded, it is that telling the truth does not bring ghosts into your home. It releases them. She tucked the notebook under her pillow, smiling at the idea of someone one day finding it and understanding a part of her heart. Her final thought before sleep was gratitude for Milagros, for Rosalina, for Tita Looning, for Paolo, for Leah, for Kule, and for every person who had ever trusted her with their unsent words. The following year, with Paolo's encouragement and the community's enthusiasm, Aster organized the first Monsoon Letters festival. They timed it for the start of the rainy season. They hung banners along Session Road, printed with calligraphy that read, "Write your rain." Stalls lined the plaza, offering envelopes, handmade paper, nibs, and ink mixed with local herbs. Elderly women taught children to fold paper boats. Teenagers composed spoken word pieces about ghosts, and grandmothers, the community theater troupe, performed a play about Milagros and Rosalina's love story, scripted based on the letters and set to a backdrop of live kulintang music. Farmers brought rice cakes to share. A man from La Union arrived with a sack of sea salt, saying he wanted to trade it for a letter to his daughter he had not seen in 12 years. A brass band played a march that turned into a waltz, and couples danced on the wet cobblestones. In the center of the plaza stood a giant mailbox painted with swirling waves and vines, inviting anyone to drop in their unsent words. At sunset, Aster, wearing a barotsaya and ink-stained fingers, climbed onto a stage. Paolo stood beside her with a microphone. She spoke not as an expert, but as a fellow letter writer. "We are here because of ink and rain," she said. "We are here because stories refuse to stay silent." She invited Leah to read her second letter to her mother, which was full of gratitude for new recipes learned from neighbors. Leah's voice shook but was met with cheers. The festival ended with a procession to the river where everyone released paper boats carrying words and candles. The sight of hundreds of tiny lights floating away made Aster's chest ache in the best possible way. The festival became an annual tradition, a rainy season celebration of vulnerability and community. One dry month, when letters trickled in rather than poured, Aster and Paolo received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a short note in shaky handwriting. "My name is Pilar. I am 90. I have carried this letter in my apron pocket since 1948. It was meant for my sweetheart, Antonio, who went to Sagada. If he is alive, or if his children are alive, please deliver it." Tucked behind the note was a letter written in indigo ink, the edges frayed, the words formal. "Dear Antonio," it began, "the mountain you gave me is growing in my stomach. Our secret is due in March." Aster and Paolo looked at each other. They could have read it on the air, but something in the paper's smell, earthy, intimate, told them this letter required a different kind of delivery. So they set out in Paolo's van, winding through steep mountain roads lined with mossy cliffs, past rice terraces carved like stairways to heaven. They stopped to buy suman from roadside vendors, sipped coffee in a shack overlooking a valley, and arrived in Sagada by afternoon. The town was quiet, its hanging coffins visible on limestone cliffs. They asked at the municipal office for records and were directed to a small hut where an elderly woman sat weaving baskets. "Pilar?" Paolo asked. She shook her head. "Pilar died 5 years ago," she said. "Her daughter lives there." They followed her pointing finger to a house surrounded by sunflowers. A middle-aged woman opened the door, her face a map of lines that broke into a surprised smile when Aster explained their purpose. "Antonio was my father," she said softly. She invited them in and read the letter, tears tracing the letters on the page. "I always wondered why my father never spoke of my half-brother," she whispered. "He died in the war. We did not know there was a child. My kuya died before he was born. Now I know my father was not heartless. He was grieving." She hugged Aster. They sat, strangers, linked by a piece of paper, drinking mountain tea and listening to the wind whistle through the pines. On the drive home, Aster realized that letters sometimes arrive too late to change events, but not too late to heal hearts. Delivering Pilar's secret felt like clearing another debt, one that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with human dignity. Months later, an envelope with foreign stamps arrived. The handwriting on the front was blocky, unpracticed, but carefully deliberate. Inside was a letter written in ballpoint pen. "Good day, Ma Master," it began. "I am writing from a cargo ship somewhere in the Arabian Sea. I am a seafarer. I read about your ghost letters on the internet during my night watch, and it made me think I left home when I was 20 to work overseas. I have sent money every month, but hardly any words. My mother keeps asking me to write. I am ashamed because I don't know what to say. I don't know how to tell her that sometimes I want to jump overboard. Sometimes I watch the horizon and imagine Baguio's fog. So I am writing to myself when I was 20. Dear younger me, you will see dolphins playing in the waves and think of freedom. You will scrub decks until your hands crack. You will miss the smell of pine. Don't be afraid to write what hurts. Please tell our mother you love her. Signed, Christian. Aster read the letter aloud on a rainy night. Paolo's voice softened when he repeated Christian's words. The following week, a woman in the market stopped Aster, tears in her eyes. My son is a seafarer, she said. He hardly writes. I heard Christian's letter. It was like hearing my own child speak. I wrote him back. I told him I missed his jokes more than his money. Later, another letter arrived from Christian. Mom, he wrote, my mother sent me a letter after she heard the broadcast. She drew hearts like she used to when I was in grade 2. I cried. The other seafarers laughed until I read it to them, and then we all cried. Now we have a writing club on the ship. Every rain in Baguio, we will send letters. Aster pictured men on a ship under alien constellations, hunched over paper, blue ink staining their calloused hands. The ocean, like the rain, carried words across unimaginable distances. On evenings when the rain held back and the sky cleared to a pale mountain blue, Aster sat on the porch with Paolo, listening to the pines whisper in the wind. A calico cat, one of Kulai's distant descendants, settled at their feet, its tail curled neatly around its paws, keeping quiet watch over the dusk. Aster marveled at how a story that began with one impossible letter had grown into a constellation of connections somewhere on seas and in valleys, in kitchens lit by single bulbs, and in the cramped bunks of ships crossing foreign waters. People picked up pens because a ghost once longed too deeply to stay quiet. She realized that bringing stories to life did not mean conjuring specters, but paying attention to the living. One letter per rain, she murmured, and in the quiet that followed, she heard the world answer with 1,000 pens scratching. The attic grows quiet now. The fire has gone out. The last page has drifted to the floor. Blank as the mercy Aster finally delivered. Somewhere in the city of pines, 2 names whispered for half a century have finally come to rest. If the monsoon carried Milagros's longing, it was Aster who returned it home. Thank you for listening to Monsoon Letters, another tale of debt, truth, and the quiet hauntings of the Filipino heart. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Tell us what lines stayed with you. Tell us who you would write to if the rain ever brought you the chance. And if you want more weekly Philippine horror and Gothic folklore from Calico Tales Publishing LLC, like this video, share it, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories travel farther than the rain ever could. Until next week, listen closely. Some letters still wander. Some stories still wait for a voice.